Welcome to Lou Palumbo's Between the Lines. Problem solving for our future. Lou. Common sense, logic, and reasoning. Lou. The man that can't stand hate and animus. Lou. Stimulating the thought process of America. Lou. Where being right is not political, it's factual. Lou. Providing real solutions in real time. And now, here's your host, Lou Palumbo.
Welcome, everyone. I guess I should wish everyone a Happy New Year. Would be appropriate. Interested to see what's different this year than was last year. I unfortunately am a little skeptical, to be very candid with you. Borders are still a major problem. If you listen to any of these podcasts prior, including this show on WBOB that I was doing for about 8 or 10 months, I constantly reminded the public as to the severity of this issue at the border. And what I find really interesting isn't so much that the FBI Director Christopher Wray said it's a threat to our national security and that's being ignored, is that we have elected Democratic officials in Arizona and Texas pleading with the federal government, Washington, D.C., to come and do something, and they're not responding. The mayor of El Paso has declared a national emergency. Now, what's really interesting about this conversation today is that, ironically, today is the day that the Republicans take over the House of Representatives, and they're trying to, I guess, decide if McCarthy's going to be the speaker. But I'm really curious to see how they traverse or how they navigate these issues that are just problematic. One of them, of course, is the economy, which seems to have everybody's undivided attention as always, because the one way to get the attention of the American public is to put your hand in their pocket. This additional $1.7 trillion spending, I bet, was ill-conceived. I'm trying to get Nick Lewin back on, who speaks very intelligently to these economic issues. He's rather brilliant in his own right. He's very successful in his own endeavors. Their installation in the House of Representatives as a control element is not going to change one thing in your major cities. For whatever reason, November 8th wasn't a defining moment with people in these communities that they've had enough, nor the borders for that matter. The foreign policy is in some regards, our fait accompli, what we did in Afghanistan, which was just unforgivable. And that's, again, a bipartisan review. You know, this was just so ill-conceived to abandon the women and young girls in Afghanistan. They've sent them back decades, left $85 billion in weaponry, and abandoned Bagram Air Base, you know. Now we're talking about conversations with Iran over nuclear energy as they're supplying drones and supporting efforts in the Ukraine by the Russians. I only can say this, and I don't mean to be funny, but the cuckoo left the clock. Curious to see exactly what the Republicans decide to do. By all rights, they could probably attempt to impeach Biden, Harris, and Mayorkas. And if you really wanted to get creative, you have treason. When you engage in activities that threaten the national security of this country, that's treasonous. That's a high crime and misdemeanor. In some worlds, like ours, they might even court-martial you and hang you. Who knows, you know? I'm not suggesting we hang the president. Don't get the wrong idea. Removal from office is probably what's appropriate because he's prancing around thinking that we had a great year last year. That all depends on where you're sitting. Certainly not in Texas. They're not feeling that way. In Arizona, they're not feeling that way. In these major cities where the federal government is indiscriminately delivering, thousands of migrants over the past year or two, they're not feeling that way. It's really interesting times we're living in. But this is going to be, in a sense, a litmus test for the Republicans. This isn't about vengeful politics because these issues they should pursue should be done regardless of your political affiliation. It's not about being a Democrat or a Republican. It's about being an American. The Hunter Biden problem, which really is just getting worse and worse because of Elon Musk's mission to disseminate information that is questionable, to say the least, about our FBI's activity and Hunter's activity. I want to say something to you guys, and it's based on experience. Sadly, once you're a junkie, especially with heroin use, you're always a junkie. It affects your DNA. It's what happens. And there isn't anyone you will not put at risk. Your family, you'll lie, you'll cheat, you steal. It's really I can't explain it to you. It's an interesting study. A lot of these controlled substances you can kind of rebound from and come back from. There's something about heroin. It does something to most people's DNA that really is just startling as to what you become capable of doing. And as Americans, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, we're entitled to know exactly to what extent Hunter Biden may have compromised this country and his father, and subsequently his father compromising this country. So, we've got some interesting questions staring us in the face. The first hurdle we have to get over is them deciding if McCarthy's going to be the Speaker of the House. I guess he's second in line to the throne, in the order of succession. He's right after the Vice President. So, but, we're in a status quo mode right now. It's the new year. I'd like us to be optimistic moving forward. I don't think spending this $1.7 trillion, which I mentioned a moment ago, in December in a rather rushed manner was very prudent. In fact, we're going to have on a gentleman who's read this 4,000 plus page document to insult the intelligence of the American public. This is kind of like Obamacare, when the Speaker of the House said, let's sign it and read it later. And that's not fiction, that's fact. Guys, you have to understand something. I'm not here to influence your thinking. I'm here to give you food for thought and to motivate you to think. That's really what this is about. And to take this country back into a direction that it belongs. One in which existed in the early 1960s when there was a different president that had the ability to speak to an entire nation and galvanize it. But I will tell you something interesting, and more people hear me say this. They're starting to wrap their arms around this. I personally believe we've overpopulated the country. I comfortably say that because we don't take care of anyone. We don't take care of our elderly, our homeless, our mentally ill, our veterans, and our children. And while we're mentioning our children, just think about America today, that in order to send your children to school, you have to put an armed law enforcement agent or possibly a private security person, preferably from the law enforcement community. Although there are probably some individuals, some special forces groups that would fit into that scenario as well because of the nature of it. But in order for them to learn, we've got to arm their environments. Oh yeah, while we're at it, let's arm the malls. Let's arm the movie theaters. Tell me what happened here, folks. We lost a generation of young children. It started April 20th of 1999 with Columbine and it's gone straight on forward since then. No accountability. We don't seem to have an accountability for anything, to be very candid with you. We listen to a lot of people talk on both sides of the aisle. And I don't want to forget the media who are at the root of our problem today because they've created your narrative and your optic. And it's distorted. It isn't truth-driven. I was kind of looking forward to this this dynamic that they were going to create in the Biden administration that was going to hold everybody's feet to the fire regarding the credibility and viability of information. It's truthfulness. It's accuracy. That went away for some reason. I don't know why. I suspect what may have done that. I'm going to bring back Bob Boyce also because, another interesting topic just popped up with this young man in New York, Congressman Santos, about him lying about education and his business practices. What the hell's the difference between him and these guys holding office today? He just did it before he got elected. We had a president that committed perjury over oral copulation. Hillary Clinton lied about Benghazi. It's the truth. I'm not saying that because I'm anti-Hillary. I'm just telling you the truth. She mishandled classified information. I'm going to bring back Mr. Boyce, and we're going to give you some really chilling information about how convoluted this has become. What Santos did is rather disturbing, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He didn't have to lie to get this job. He just had to speak to the issues intelligently and offer a solution, right? That would have gotten him elected. We have a very special guest today, a gentleman, Doctor Michael Hanemann. I'm going to ask the doctor how to pronounce his last name properly. He was the Chancellor's Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at UC Berkeley for 35 years. He's currently a Wrigley Professor in the Department of Economics in the School of Sustainability at Arizona, the state where he's taught this for about 12 years, ladies and gentlemen. This guy's got more credentials than I have hair on my head, and I got lots of hair. He's written a number of books. He's currently writing a textbook on the economics of water. He was elected as a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 2011. He served on the California Water Rights Agency's economic staff and designed the water rates that LA used for a very successful 25-year period. He has an undergraduate degree in philosophy, just like I do, although I got a feeling he's a little smarter than I am, and politics and economics from Oxford, a master's degree in economics from the London School of Economics, and a Ph.D. in economics from Harvard. So he's clearly one of the best and the brightest, and I won't go off onto that because I'm looking at what the best and brightest have done to the country. But I want to bring this gentleman in because this is going to be a very interesting conversation, and I'm going to be honest with you guys. I'm in over my head with this man because I have a suspicion that he forgot more than I know about this topic, although I do know something about it, having lived on both coasts simultaneously because of work purposes. And I do know they've been dealing with this water issue as well as rolling blackouts for decades. We're going to take a quick break. I do want to thank our sponsors, Instacart and Buzzsprout. They are legitimate. This Buzzsprout is the platform in which this podcast is built off of, and we do use Instacart. It does work, guys. It's legitimate. So I think we're ready to bring this gentleman in a moment, but we're going to go to a quick break, and we'll be right back with you. Instacart, another interesting concept. You can go to your favorite grocery stores, sign on to their application without leaving your home, the comfort of your home. Just pick out the items you'd like. They'll assign a personal shopper for you and deliver them to the point that you would like them delivered to. Another great concept, very user-friendly, and I'll be honest, we use it also. It's very effective, and they're very, very good. They're very on point. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're back, and I have Dr. Hanemann with me, Dr. Michael Hanemann. I don't think I have enough time to speak to how in-depth his background and his credentials are. I want to allow him to give us the highlights of his life, which I'm going to tell you are going to be quite impressive. So I yield to you, Dr. Hanemann.
Well, I came to America to do my Ph.D. At Harvard, and I got interested in the field we now call environmental and resource economics, but it didn't exist when I was a graduate student. So I've been fortunate enough to grow up with that field. I came to Berkeley. I created a course on the economics of water, which was a terrific way of forcing me to learn the subject. After 35 years at Berkeley, I retired from teaching. I came to ASU 12 years ago. I teach at ASU. I do research here and still at Berkeley. I'm a research professor at Berkeley. I had an innocent life as an academic for the first 7-8 years, and then I was asked to serve as the economic staff for California's Water Rights Agency, which I did for 6 years during the course, among other things, of a major water war. From then on, I learned about water rights and the political side of water. I've continued to teach water. I've worked on litigation in water. I also work on the field called non-market valuation, which is measuring the economic value to people of the natural environment. And I've been involved in the litigation for the Exxon Valdez oil spill for the federal government and then for the Deepwater Horizon. So between litigation, teaching, and research, I've learned a lot. There's still a lot I don't know.
And that's the best thing about getting up every day, sir. You know, you learn something. When you stop learning, you stop living. I just want to ask you this because I was in college from 69 through 74. What years were you at Berkeley? Because Berkeley's a very colorful school.
Oh, it's wonderful. I came in 1968, I guess. 69 was my first summer. So I was in Berkeley from 1968 to 2011. And from 2011 to now, I've been at ASU. And I was in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics in the College of Natural Resources. And so I taught students in the economics department, but I wasn't in the economics department.
Before I forget, ladies and gentlemen, this gentleman has written quite a number of books that we're going to get into a little bit later. I'm going to, again, let him tell you exactly about his writings. But Dr. Hanemann, I want to ask you, there's obviously a water problem. I don't mean to be simplistic in terms, but I'm not in your league, so let me be real clear about this. I've got my wheelhouse, and I know you have yours. This water issue focuses a lot on California, and there are some very serious implications in California because of agriculture to start with and the manner in which it rains there. You know, my understanding is that parts of California are coastal deserts. I want to ask you this question, sir, to start with. Is there a reason they haven't built reservoirs or employed technology to trap the water when they get these torrential rainfalls like they're getting right now, sir?
So we have reservoirs, but there are two factors. One, atmospheric rivers have become recognized as a phenomenon really in the last 15 years or so.
Sir, can you, not to interrupt you, sir, explain more specifically what an atmospheric reservoir translates to, because our listeners, I want to make sure they can stay with you.
Right. Well, it's always been true that the clouds come in from the west across the Pacific, and that brings our rain. But it was about 15 years ago that atmospheric scientists saw the pattern of moisture coming across the Pacific. And they saw it was concentrated in very dense streams of moisture, and they coined the phrase atmospheric river. So that particular bands of moisture at particular locations, particularly in northern or hitting Northern California. And this is a feature, partly a feature of climate change. So one of the consequences of climate change is warmer temperature, more evaporation, more moisture in the atmosphere. And just you understand, climate warming has gone on since 1800 or so. But if you look at the last 100 plus years, there was warming over the United States up to about 1950. And then there was a period in the United States of relative stagnation from 1950 to almost 1980. And then there has been warming starting in the late 70s, accelerating around 2000. And so we have really had 40 years of significant warming. And of course, it takes time for effects to build up, and it takes time for people to notice the effects. And so there's a sense in general in which the effects of warming in the US, which have been predicted since the 80s, really have only become noticeable since around 2000. And the atmospheric rivers fall into that category. They were first noticed in the mid-2000s. And they are what we had last weekend and what we're going to get later this week. And so the point is, there's not necessarily an increase in the total amount of rainfall annually. What's changing is the rainfall is now a small number of very intense rainfall episodes. And to answer your question, the one answer is the reservoirs we have in California weren't designed for that intensity of rainfall. And the second thing is the reservoirs in California were designed mainly to carry water over from the spring to the summer and fall. On the Colorado River, which is a different situation, the reservoirs were designed, Lake Powell, to carry 10 years worth of water that was to be delivered to the southern basin states. So the Colorado River reservoirs were designed to carry water over for several years. The California reservoirs were basically designed to handle California's climate, which is typically we get rain in the winter months, but not the summer. So the rainfall between, say, April and September is maybe 5% of the annual rainfall.
May I ask you a question, sir?
Yeah.
You alluded to Colorado's reservoirs. Is there a reason that California hasn't constructed a comparable reservoir like Colorado has, which sounds like it might help mitigate a little bit of this problem? And I want to ask you a follow-up question as well, sir. Is there a way to harness this rain? In other words, do you think there's a technology that can be implemented that would allow us to channel the rain? In other words, instead of having it wash out towns, Doctor, why not figure out ways to channel it into reservoirs or other holding areas instead of, I lived on the West Coast, sir. I lived up in Malibu, so I've witnessed quite a bit up there between the fires and the floods. I watched the water come from the canyons like rivers through the homes on Pacific Coast Highway and into the Atlantic Ocean. So I would like you, if you could help me for the audience's purpose, why isn't California matching wits with what they've done in Colorado?
So the crucial difference with the Colorado River is that it was an interstate battle. The river, going back years to 1922, was divided up among the states, or I should say the states agreed to divide it up among them. And the agreement they reached divided the upper basin states from the lower basin states, the lower basin states being California, Arizona, and Nevada. And most of the water development in 1922 was in California, and to a lesser extent, Arizona, much less than in the upper basin, Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, Utah. And so the way the states reached agreement among themselves was dividing up the flow, which they divided up 7.5 million acre feet to the lower basin, 7.5 million acre feet to the upper basin, some left over for Mexico and other contingencies. They were dividing up, they thought, 19 million acre feet of flow. We now know that the stream flow at that time was only about 15 million acre feet. And for the last 100 years, it's been under 14 million acre feet, more like 13. So they were dividing up more stream flow than they had, but put that aside. In order to guarantee the basin wanted, which was using more of the water, wanted to be sure of getting its water. And so Lake Powell and originally Lake Mead, the idea was that that would hold 10 years supply for the lower basin. So the idea was you'd fill this reservoir to ensure 10 years supply for the lower basin states. And that was sort of the requirement that the lower basin states made and the upper basin agreed. Within California, this was one state, the federal Central Valley Project and then the California Water Project. And so, as it were, there was a higher degree of trust among the water-rich areas in the north and the water users in the south. And so it didn't seem worth spending money to create a vast amount of storage. And
were they right about those, sir? Were they right about that?
Well, here's the thing. The impact of climate change on stream flow really only started showing up about 20 years ago in 2000. It was predicted in the 1980s, but it really only became a phenomenon. And so planning done before 2000, and in fact before the 1980s, just assumed a static hydrology. The hydrology in the future was the same as it was going to be the same as it had been for the last 100 years. And so that was a mistake. It was understandable. The situation with the Colorado River that's unforgivable is starting in the early 2000s, it became clear that there was a change in stream flow. In Colorado, there's been a drought since 2000. And the states kept using water as though nothing was changing, as though this was a blip and things would go back to normal. And that's something that, as time passed since 2000 is unjustified. You ask about harnessing the rains.
No, can I ask you one favor, sir? Mm-hmm. I want to go to a quick break, and then we're going to go into this harnessing of the rains, because that's a very interesting question and curiosity I have. Guys, just stick with us today. This is Dr. Michael Hanemann. I suggest you Google him, because I don't have enough time to tell you about his background. It's just overwhelming, his accomplishments and his contribution, which is really a critical part of this discussion. And I'm going to put the finger on him to ask him what the solution is to a lot of this. We're going to be right back. Just stick with us, guys. So let me tell you a little bit about Buzzsprout. Very interesting concept. Basically, it allows you to set up your own podcast. One of the most advantageous things about using Buzzsprout is it's user-friendly. So I encourage you highly, if your inclination is to create your own podcast, please look into Buzzsprout. And by the way, we use it. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. I have Dr. Michael Hanemann. I just want to use the word that it's appropriate. This man is brilliant. I'll synopsize his educational career with a Ph.D. from Harvard. Need I say more? I want you to continue in our conversation, sir, as we were prior to this break, and I apologize for that rude interruption by the producer. It's not me. I want you to know that, sir. But go ahead, sir.
So you asked about harnessing rain. And yes, there are efforts to do this. So if you let rain stay on the fields, so in the winter months, many fields in the Central Valley of California are bare. They plant crops in March or April. They harvest in maybe October. But right now, this bare ground, that in many parts of the Central Valley, not everywhere, there's actually groundwater aquifers beneath the fields. And so what you want to do is build berms or whatever to create a lake in each field, a little lake, and let the water soak into the ground. And you can do that also if you have crops like tree crops. You can plant things. You don't want to overwater the tree roots, but you want to store water so it'll soak into the ground. And there is now a motivation to do this more extensively. And I'm sure that's happening right now. It's been discussed for the last 3 or 4 years in the context of groundwater depletion, and I'm sure that's happening.
Doctor, if I may just interject, California has a reported $97 billion surplus. So there's plenty of money there to undertake these projects, and I'm going to take you off onto a tangent about electricity in a little while, so be prepared. But the money's there to explore this remedy. Am I right, sir?
Well, when you say what I'm describing, farmers sort of arranging their fields in the winter so that they'll temporarily store water that will soak into the ground. That doesn't need a large investment on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's fragmented because you do it farmer by farmer and field by field. And that's it. Building a new reservoir, that's very expensive. And the extremely expensive. Construction costs have risen over the decades. And the real hang-up is who's going to pay for that. And in particular, the farmers don't have the willingness or the ability to pick up most of the cost.
Do you want me to answer that question for you as to who should pay for it, sir? And I just listened to you say something about it goes farmer by farmer. This is something that should be mandated by the state, number one, and subsidized by the state, because we're not in a position to lose the farming industry, correct me if I'm wrong, in California. Would you agree with that statement, sir?
We want to keep the farming industry, but an underlying question is how much should the taxpayer spend to preserve farming water supply?
Sir, I don't want to get political with you today, okay, sir?
Yeah.
How critical a problem is this for the state of California and the country right now, and possibly the globe? This government seems to have hundreds of billions of dollars to spew across the planet, some of it going to the Ukraine. The mayor in the city of New York with 30,000 migrants, and I don't want this to get political with you, but you're asking a very important question. Who should pay for it? We should give Eric Adams $1 billion for people illegal in the country and not allocate money towards the farmers. Half our produce, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, and produce, fruit and vegetables in this country come out of California, not to mention our export business. So when we throw that question out, who should be responsible? Look at the way this country just disseminates monies across the planet. Let the government step up to the plate, state and federal. Because this is, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Hanemann, this is a problem that's going to have a cataclysmic result if we don't get our hands on it. Am I right?
It will. How cataclysmic remains to be seen. Because other regions produce food also, although they have, like Chile, have a similar climate and a similar issue with climate change. I will agree with you that underlying this is a series of difficult political decisions. And the inability to make these decisions, and there's a range of them, and I'll mention a couple more, is really an underlying vulnerability to climate change, as well as to other world events. Climate change affects water supply, the reliability of water supply. Water is an extremely expensive commodity. Supplying water, whether for cities or for farming, in general, is more expensive than supplying electricity or telecommunications.
And why is that, sir? Would you explain why that is, please?
Yeah, because the water supply infrastructure is more capital intensive than electricity infrastructure or telecom infrastructure. It's the most capital-intensive commodity. That's the first thing. The second thing is the capital is more long-lived than for any other utilities. You know, dams for 150, 200 years, aqueducts for 100. So they're much longer lifetime. And the other thing, and this is particularly an issue in California, but other arid places, the water is nowhere near where most of the people are. So you need a connectivity. You need, and aqueducts or pipelines are part of the big expense. And the challenge you face, and this is in general the most extreme challenge with water, you have to have the whole system in place before you can deliver a drop of water in someone's home or in someone's field. And so you have to finance upfront this extremely comprehensive, extremely capital-intensive infrastructure. And so you can't do it piece by piece. You can't do it pay as you go. You know, we build a bit of a pipeline this decade, and then next decade we'll extend it another 10%. So the finances of water, both for urban and for irrigation, are the most difficult problem than for any other utility. And that's part of the extreme difficulty with dealing with we face. Very quickly, let me mention one thing. You said, well, if we could harness the rain, we wouldn't have the washed out towns. In California, we probably still would have the washed out towns because we are protected in the Central Valley, particularly the Sacramento Valley, by a levee system built about 100 years ago, 110 years ago, 120, which is failing. The statistic is when Katrina hit New Orleans, that was not rated the worst flood threat in the United States. The worst flood threat was the city of Sacramento, which is getting hit now. And that is a fragmented network of poorly maintained, dikes that are going to show up as a problem, even if we harness some of the rain.
Sir, can I ask you a question, please? Do you think that the governor in the state of California is aware of or is invested properly in this problem that they're facing there? I mean, there's one thing I do want to say also to the listeners who are maybe not familiar with California. There is a lot of the topography that they build on that they tell you not to build on. That's part of the problem, sir. They build in the canyons. You're not supposed to. It makes it difficult to fight fires. There's not enough water in the canyons. When they build the roadways, the infrastructure, the fire apparatus can't maneuver. I learned a lot living in Malibu. So there are inherent problems just based on man's insinuation into the environment. That feeds a lot of this issue of when you see these towns get washed out. But, my question to you, sir, is the government in California aware of this? Are they in conversation with you, sir, so they can start to address this problem? Because this problem isn't going away.
I agree. So another aspect of the topography is gold mining. So gold mining in the 1860s and 1870s consisted of flushing away mountainsides to get at the ore underneath. That raised the bed of the Sacramento River, I believe, 5 or 6 feet, and made it more prone to flood when you had heavy rains, including in the 19th century. And that was partly the motivation for the levee system that was built. And just one anecdote, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor in January 2004, if I remember. And there was a budgetary crisis. And one of the things he did was to cut various state agency budgets, including the flood control budget, whatever the agency was. So in June 2004, on a sunny day, blue skies, no rain, a major levee collapsed and flooded one of the islands in this Sacramento River. It cost $100 million to pump out that island. And that was a huge shock, a rude shock to Governor Schwarzenegger. And he got religion about the Delta, the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, and spending money to protect it. And some of the suburbs of San Francisco have moved into what was floodland that's vulnerable in the Delta. And to answer your question, California has been very aware of the vulnerability to climate change, going back to the 1990s. And starting in 2002, it set up a project called the Climate Change Scenarios Project to examine how California might be affected under climate change scenarios, including the flood risk. And I helped direct that project. And so there's been awareness of this issue, for the last 20 years.
But, sir, awareness, if I may interrupt you, sir, awareness is one discussion. Being proactive and addressing it is another discussion. So my question to you, Doctor, is, with this awareness, have they done anything to mitigate?
There are two issues, or two constraints: money and fragmentation. So the levee systems, for example, are controlled by a network of small levee districts. It's one continuous levee system, but separate chunks of it are controlled by separate districts. And so Schwarzenegger subsequently restored the levee protection budget that he cut. And so I said California has been focusing on the vulnerabilities to climate change, including but not limited to water, flooding, water shortage, fire. I would say that for the first 10 years or so, from 2002 to about 2012, 13, 14, the focus of the state was noting vulnerability. But since then, for about the last 10 years, it has really been paying attention to adaptation and raising funds and allocating funds to actually make us more resilient. But it's a huge challenge, and we have a long, long way to go.
We're going to go to a quick break, Doctor, if I may, and we're going to come back, continue this conversation with Dr. Hanemann. As you guys can tell, it is just full of information and learning, and that's what this is about. We'll be right back, guys. Just stick with us. Guys, we're back, ladies and gentlemen. We have Dr. Michael Hanemann. Brilliant is the word. Taught at UC Berkeley for about 35 years, currently at Arizona State, Ph.D. from Harvard. He's got so many credentials that I've lost track, and I've been reading about him for 2 days. I've got to be honest with you, and I can't tie the whole damn show up with telling you what his accomplishments have been. But I want to continue this conversation. Obviously, Governor Schwarzenegger was on the learning curve. I don't want to defend the governor, but, when he inherited the state, it was in a rather, I would say, economic disarray. And he cut budgets as, the head of state of a state does. And, he's on a learning curve. I think that's a big part of it. I don't mind the mistake. Lloyd will tell you we live with them every day in our own world. It's about acknowledging them, learning from them, and going forward. So I do see this as a very layered and complicated problem, if I'm correct, sir. And my thing about this show is to offer solutions. So can I ask you, Dr. Hanemann, what's the solution to the water problem? What would you recommend, sir? And let me ask you this also. Are they on the phone with you on a consistent basis to get some guidance from you?
No, I have advised administrations before, but there, I think now many people talking to the state who are well informed. And let me say, so I greatly admire Arnold Schwarzenegger and what he did and his awareness of the water issues and the climate change issues. Also continued under Jerry Brown. So Jerry Brown was maybe the least successful governor in California's history, but I think he was also one of the most successful the second time around when he did it not as a callow youth, but as a wise old man. California has had excellent leadership compared to other states with regard to climate change. It made this a focus of state attention and spending, as I say, starting 2000, way ahead of most other states.
I agree with you, sir. I think California is a very forward-thinking, progressive-thinking state. I won't get into the rest of the political dynamics running our cities because I know that it all intersects. You can be too progressive and too intellectual. I'm an academic by background. I was a philosophy major in college also. I have a strong suspicion I didn't study as hard as you did, though, sir, to be very candid with you. I want to ask you about this whole climate change discussion and just give you my perspective and then have you critique it because, I'm on the learning curve with you today. My assessment is that this could be a cumulative product of a cycle of nature with the contribution of mankind with contaminants and what do they call it, fluorocarbons or emissions.
Yes.
Is that what's happening, sir, or is it just simply we're in a cycle? What's going on here, and what's the fix? Now, I do understand also, I believe I read something, Doctor, that the ozone layer in the country had repaired itself about 60%. Is that an accurate?
So let me say, I'm not a real scientist. I'm an economist. So what I know is what I've learned.
You sound like a scientist, for God's sakes.
But what I know is what I've learned from working with colleagues in these disciplines. My understanding from them, and that includes Dan Kayan and colleagues at Scripps, which was a major California's climate change studies, is that this is not a cycle of nature. This is a cumulative buildup. And it's happened before in the history of the world. That is, there have been high levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but on a time frame of tens of millions of years or more, not on a short time frame. And so I think my understanding is that the strong consensus in science is that it is associated. It's largely man-made. Burning fossil fuels, also, for example, releasing land use practices which release carbon from the soil, also methane and gases from cows and other animals. So it's multiple sources. The other thing that comes out of the science is while this has happened before, it is happening vastly faster on a time scale. It's more than before. So the rise in sea level, for example, as you went from an ice age to melting, it took place over several thousand years. And we may experience that rise in sea level in several hundred years, not thousands of years. And so the speed at which things are happening is unprecedented, as well as the fact that there were far fewer human beings around when.
Oh, you just hit my topic about overpopulation, but go ahead, sir.
No, so I think the way we are, we're very vulnerable. Now, let me say, so obviously we need to prepare and adapt. In my own experience, the problem with climate change, I'd say until just now, has been the general sense that this was something that would happen in the future. So, for example, in 2004, I participated in one of the first sets of studies of how climate change might affect California. And that was published, multi-authored paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But then I and other authors briefed various agencies in California, and I briefed water agencies. And the response then was something like this: we are busy right now dealing with the legacy of the past, dealing with problems of water development over the last 50, 60 years. This climate change is going to be a problem in the future. Don't bother me now. Run along, Sonny. Come back later when I have, more time on my hands. And that's totally understandable because the current problems that they were dealing with were very difficult. But that was the general thing. My own hunch is that last year, I should say, starting in mid-2001 and continuing, climate change has suddenly hit home, and climate change is happening. It'll happen on a larger scale in the future, but what's happened in the Colorado River, in the Mississippi River, what's happening in Europe, suddenly climate change is now. And so until now, the notion was, we'll deal with this later, we'll figure things out. And I think this is now a pivot point where we need to start thinking about action now.
Dr. Hanemann, may I interrupt you, sir? Is there a road back?
That's a question for scientists, physicists, and so on. But my understanding is no. That on the whole, no. So you can do some things to modify the carbon cycle, but and you can even, there are technologies, including ones developed by Klaus Lackner, professor and colleague at ASU, that can pull carbon dioxide out of the air, but not on a scale that's so. My understanding of what the scientists conclude is that we're locked in more or less to the current level of warming. And if the warming increases, the effects are not, they can be reduced some, but they're not reversible.
What they say, sir, is that, for example, in the state of Florida, because of climate change, they're predicting more frequency and more intense hurricanes, for example, and they even allude to cities like Miami going underwater. This, I gather, is all pretty credible information. Am I correct?
I mean, that's my understanding. Again, this is not my field of knowledge, but I have been reading the literature, for 20 years now, and that's my takeaway from the literature.
Sir,
Let me say the other problem is this is going to be costly in many, not just water supply infrastructure, protecting the coastline from flooding. The simple example, many cities, including San Francisco, including Chicago, including Boston, and I think New York, the storm drains bypass the sewage treatment plant, and the stormwater is released to the ocean. As the ocean rises, you'll get sea level coming into the storm drains. Some cities have combined sewers. The stormwater actually doesn't bypass the sewage treatment and goes through it. In those places, the outlets will let seawater get into the sewage treatment plant, and that kills the sewage treatment process. So what you need to do is raise sewer outlets, whatever, 8 inches, 9 inches. Well, it's not rocket science, but there's a lot of sewer outlets, and it's going to be a big expense. And that, that sort of thing is going to happen many times over. There's lots of modifications.
Dr. Hanemann, I have to interrupt you, sir, because we've run out of time today. And as I suspected, we need more time. And to everyone listening to this, and this is really something very important, my favorite people are people that are smarter than I am, because that's how I learn. And
me too.
Yeah, we're all in that same wheelhouse there. If your head's screwed on tight, you love smart people because you learn from them. And we've learned a lot today, but I have a sneaky suspicion there's a lot more to discuss here. We didn't get into electricity, desalination, and this continuation of the impact of water on the planet and the economics attached to it. Dr. Hanemann, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I want a commitment, a hard commitment from you. You're coming back soon because we need to continue this conversation. I wish I was in Arizona to go to class with you, but I'm not. I want to thank you for joining us, sir. I cannot thank you enough. This was just overwhelmingly informative, which is really what the process is about. Guys, this has been Between the Lines. I want to just say very quickly, sir, how can people find you, Dr. Hanemann?
I have two emails, Hanemann@berkeley.edu and michael.hanemann@asu.edu. They both come to the same place.
Very good. And the next time we're on, sir, I want you to go through the litany of articles and books you've written so people can continue this learning process. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Lou Palumbo. This has been Between the Lines, and we can't thank this gentleman enough. See you next week, guys.